Hello and welcome to another episode of Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Today we will be discussing the importance of Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Saudi Arabia, his third visit this year. Now, Prime Minister Imran Khan met with Saudi King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud and his son Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on Tuesday. He was accompanied by his foreign minister and other senior officials. Now, Prime Minister Khan has visited Iran also 2 days before this trip, and he met there with President Rouhani as well as Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran. Now, Prime Minister Khan was asked by US President Donald Trump on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly last month to mediate between the tensions in the Middle East, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran, as well as US-Iran tensions. Now, between these developments, what we've seen is Prime Minister Khan making these trips with the sole intention to facilitate or to act as a mediator between all arch rivals, and especially at a time where relationship is being seen as going from bad to worse. I'm talking about the Yemen's Houthis taking responsibility of the drone and missile attacks on Saudi oil fields that wiped out half their production. The US and Saudi Arabia were very quick to blame Iran for this, something that Iran refuses to take responsibility for. Now, again, the risk of clashes between Saudi Arabia and Iran have escalated in the past few days, especially after the incident where an Iranian tanker was hit when passing close to Saudi coast last week. Now, we will be talking to our guests about these mediation efforts and how far they're going. So without much further ado, let me introduce who is joining us today. We have with us Mr. Khan Hasham bin Sadiq, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He's joining us from Islamabad. And also we have with us Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmad, international relations expert, joining us from Sleboda. Welcome to both of you to the show. I want to start with you, Mr. Sadiq, about this development. First off, I'd like to hear your opinion on how you're seeing Prime Minister Imran Khan's efforts right now when we're seeing such high tensions in the Middle East.
I think Pakistan has strategic relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the last so many years, and Iran being our neighbor, the relations with Iran are hugely important from Pakistan's perspective. The position of Pakistan has all along been, whether the governmental or from people of Pakistan, to see to it that the relations between the two important Muslim countries and remains cordial, and see to it that there is no conflictual situation which may arise. Mm-hmm. So Pakistan has been playing its due role, and in the past few years, most notably in the recent as 2016, mm-hmm. The then Prime Minister and along with Chief of Army Staff visited both Iran and Saudi Arabia to not only mediate but to advise the leadership of the two countries, mm-hmm. To see to it that all the disputes are resolved in a peaceful manner. Being an important country and close to the vital region of Gulf.
Okay. So when you say that it should be resolved in a peaceful manner, Dr. Ishtiaq, if I could get you into this conversation also, and something that Mr. Sadiq also mentioned, this is not the first time that Pakistan is playing the role of a mediator between Iran and Saudi Arabia. In fact, in the past, four such recent incidents have taken place where Pakistan has played this role. But considering how Pakistan's role has maybe changed after the UNGA session where Prime Minister Khan gave a very powerful speech addressing the kind of crisis in Indian-occupied Kashmir is in, do you think the dynamics might have changed for as its role as a mediator?
Well, I must say that we are dealing here with a very complicated situation. This is not the first time that the Persian Gulf is in crisis. It was in crisis back in the 80s, especially after the revolution in Iran and other developments in the region. There was a war between Iran and Iraq, and I remember at that time also, throughout these 8 years, Pakistan many times offered to play a role of a mediator. Now, obviously, until the two sides accept the offer and then the mediation effort begins, it never materialized during those 8 years. Back in the 90s, again, there was a tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I remember in 1997, Pakistan especially organized an extraordinary Islamic Summit of the OIC in Islamabad, and to mark its 50th anniversary as well. But on the sidelines, an important development took place that the Saudi king and the then president of Iran, President Rafsanjani, were able to meet on the sidelines of that summit. And an impression was generated that Islamabad basically tried to mediate the differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this would be the third time, historically speaking, at least in the last 30, 40 years, that Pakistan has again showed its willingness to mediate between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Things are much more complex as we speak now. Although there are possibilities that the leadership in both Saudi Arabia and Iran, behind the scenes, in my opinion, are willing to reconcile. But problem is that, especially even in the aftermath of the 2015 nuclear deal over Iran's nuclear program, Iran's, approach throughout the Arab world, starting from Lebanon, then to Yemen, then to Syria, Iran has been backing the regimes which are somehow anti-Israel or anti-Arab monarchies. Iran has been hobnobbing with the proxies, in these countries, the Houthis in Yemen, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the, extremist groups, say, in Iraq.
So it's fighting its proxy wars, you're saying. It's fighting proxy wars in the region. That is the main bone of contention, not only with Saudi Arabia, but also the US. But hold that thought. Let me come back to you, Ms. Ishtiaq. While we're talking about efforts made by Pakistan, we saw also just in the past 24 hours news reports of Prime Minister Imran Khan giving an interview to a leading international news channel where he said he was positive about the developments here. Of course, there's no further detail into how the Saudi leadership has responded in terms of what they plan to do moving ahead with tensions. How do you see the next few days evolving in terms of tensions between the two?
I think, as I said earlier, and some of the issues mentioned by Dr. Ishtiaq, he's right on the money with respect to the complexity and the volatility of situation inside the Gulf. Obviously, there are regional players and there are extra-regional players who have strategic interest in the region. So that's why the situation gets more complicated. I see positivity. And at the moment, Pakistan has always played not only overtly but covertly, not necessarily a mediator but a facilitator to bring the two sides together to a negotiating table, whether behind the scenes. Obviously, I'm not privy to what all has transpired during these discussions, but for a starting point, I think the crisis in Yemen, where Pakistan has taken a principled position of that the conflict should be resolved in terms of UN Security Council Resolution 2216 and the Gulf Peace Initiative. I think that will be a good starting point for the two countries where they could resolve this Yemen issue, which is wholly resolvable, and the two sides have shown over the past few months to see to it that the sufferings in Yemen and the catastrophe that has befallen on ordinary Yemenis can be solved. So I think if we, in terms of tangible or actionable starting points, Yemen will be a good point. I just want to make, with respect to the probability or possibility of conflict breaking out inside the Gulf, I foresee that there are global interests in the Gulf. I do not foresee an armed altercation between the regional countries or even the extra-regional countries in the foreseeable future, because the stakes of global community and regional countries and the countries which abet the Gulf region are too high. So I don't foresee that. And hopefully situations will calm down further through these international efforts.
So you're very positive there will be no armed conflict here at a time where tensions are continuously rising. And also, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmad, we've seen that the US had been keen or had shown indication that it was ready to hold talks with Iran and with the help of the French President Emmanuel Macron, but they didn't go through because President Rouhani didn't want to speak to the US. It seems that the US has already created an impression of a regional player that does not, as a global player that cannot be trusted. Do you think that leaves room and space for others to step in, like Prime Minister Imran Khan?
Yeah, my answer is yes. Because especially during the Trump administration, there has not been any continuity in policy. He says one thing one time and then altogether a different approach next time. So because of that, US as a mediator or as a power which, through war or otherwise, tries to settle down long-standing, issues in the Gulf, that credibility is, I think, relatively lost, especially now recently. This Turkish military assault against the Kurds in northern Syria, that is the latest example. But I would like to pinpoint a few positives. Number one, Iran is our neighbor. Saudi Arabia is a very strategic ally rooted in history. Imran Khan as a prime minister has built a personal rapport with Mohammed bin Salman. He is the guy who matters in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman wants to change things in Saudi Arabia. He's supervising, actually steering revolutionary reforms, economic, social, political. Now, such a person would always like to make peace with the neighbors. And that is I think, not overtly expressed policy of Saudi Arabia, that they would like to reach out to Iran. And obviously, directly reaching out, there is a complication. So, perhaps both of these countries have also opted for mediation by Pakistan. Now, Pakistan has to be very careful. Everybody knows that we, get certain financial benefits from Saudi Arabia, apart from the moral and Muslim-centric relationship and strategic past, which every Muslim country does. We have to be very careful that Iran is our neighbor. We have stakes with Iran as well. But everybody also knows that we have much bigger stakes with Saudi Arabia. So if there is a personal connectivity between the two leaders, young leaders, that should be used to mediate a very, very complicated situation between two brotherly Muslim countries, where, unlike the past, issues are many and they have become very complicated.
Right.
But there is a scope, because now in regional economic integration, I think the perceptions of Iran and the approach of Saudi Arabia, there is enormous compatibility. And in that, Pakistan also is busy in the same thing, as part of BRI, CPAC, in which Saudi Arabia, at least, apart from UAE, has become a partner.
Right.
So there is a lot of, in a wider, rather than against the past geopolitical centric discourse that used to take place, now it is talk of geo-economic, trans-regional economic linkages. Okay. Within that, I think the overall regional economic interests of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, China, Russia, even to some extent America as an outside player, are compatible in my opinion.
So you see them aligned. But coming back to you, Mr. Sadiq's concern that Dr. Ahmad has voiced about that Pakistan has to be careful. Of course, their relationship with Saudi Arabia, with Iran has been positive. But with Saudi Arabia, just recently, we saw a huge loan package of $6 billion given to Pakistan. What are your concerns about what is at stake for Pakistan when mediating on such a sensitive issue?
I think we are quite clear. We are, in fact, grateful to the leadership of Saudi Arabia for extending help to Pakistan, both political, financial, and moral support and diplomatic support to various forums all over the world over the past so many years. Therefore, in our foreign relations, the question is not either or. We would want to take both the countries along with each other and also facilitate in a way which is acceptable to both Saudi Arabia and Iranian government as to how the current impasse over a number of issues between Iran and Saudi Arabia can be resolved. Pakistan has played it very well over in the historical context between Iran-Iraq war and during the Gulf War, and so many other examples are there where Pakistan has been able to manage its relations both as per the aspiration of the Iranian government and also while fulfilling the strategic interests of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So I don't foresee, as Dr. Ishtiaq said, there appears to be appetite for reconciliation and resolving the various issues that confront these two most important countries in the region and in the Islamic world. Therefore, Pakistan facilitation, I find it very timely, but it has to be professionally handled and carefully articulated. So therefore, addressing the sensitivities of both the countries simultaneously.
Right. Dr. Ahmad, while Pakistan, it seems you're both in agreement here, is playing its cards really well and carefully here at a time which is also a great opportunity for Pakistan. But Prime Minister Khan also said after this meeting with at least President Rouhani, he said that this is an evolving situation, and he talked about that he's very positive. At the same time, he said, one thing I've realized is that President Trump doesn't believe in wars. But let's not forget that the same US President Trump is also behind some of the most spontaneous decisions that has left conflict zones in the lurch, for example, Syria. So having this kind of a player involved in talks, doesn't it put Pakistan itself in a very precarious position?
Well, kindly notice, the development in recent days. One is that on the one hand, the Americans have withdrawn the last segment of U.S. troops from Syria, 1,000 plus. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, thousands of U.S. troops are landing again in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, that is with relevance to the threat that Saudi Arabia perceives from Iran or Iran's support to the proxy and elements across the Arab world. Even in the recent attack, which brought down the production of oil in Saudi Arabia almost to a half, the missile attack, which Saudi Arabia and United States claimed that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards basically were behind it. It has created the latest, round of tension. And obviously, the risk of war or the, coming to the surface of another big Persian Gulf conflict like the war of Iraq, back in the 90s, it is there. And therefore, it is extremely important that Pakistan has emerged, apart from the international discourse, which is extremely positive on Kashmir in the past 2 months or so. Diplomatically speaking, Pakistan has emerged as a key player once again, at least on issues of peace and security, not just in South Asia, but also in the Middle East or in West Asia. So I think it's a great opportunity for us that we should play our role, our influence with the Saudis and our closeness with the Iranians on the one hand, and we should play our part very well, and we should prevent the slide into a grand conflict in the Gulf once again in the last 30 or 40 years.
Prevent this slide into a large conflict once again, and Pakistan is playing a key role here, once again showing its importance in the region, especially in the Middle East, as you mentioned, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmad. Well, we've run out of time here. I'd just like to thank both of you, Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmad and Mr. Khan Hasham bin Sadiq, for joining us here for this conversation about Prime Minister Imran Khan, Pakistan's role in diffusing tensions in the Middle East. With this, we'll take a quick short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. We were just talking about Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Saudi Arabia and what it means for regional tensions. Also continuing this conversation of more tensions in the Middle East, we will be updating you on the developments on the Syria offensive by Turkey. Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, they met yesterday at 10 Downing Street in London, and they both agreed that Turkey's military operation against the Kurdish fighters in northeast Syria had to end. At the same time, while they expressed concern over what is unfolding now in northeast Syria as a result of Turkey's offensive, at the same time they agree that the value of Turkey as a NATO ally is pretty high. They recognize the role Turkey has played in supporting refugees from the Syrian conflict. So today we'll be looking into the role that NATO is playing at a time when its second biggest ally, Turkey, continues to go ahead without any other member state's consent, and also in the light of a widely protested move from the international forum. So is this protest loud in general enough? Let's ask our guest. Let me introduce who's joining us today. We have Mr. Mark Sleboda, international relations expert in security and analyst, joining us from Moscow, and also Mr. Robbie Travers, a political commentator, joining us from London. Thank you for taking out the time, gentlemen, for this conversation. As the developments come in, I want to start with you, Mr. Sleboda. The European Union, it seems, has been not completely on board when it comes to condemning the move that Turkey has made. How are you seeing this latest development?
Yeah, I find it very interesting because, of course, this isn't the first Turkish military incursion and occupation into Syria in the last few years. Turkey has already invaded and continues to militarily occupy the entirety of the Jarablus corridor and the western Kurdish canton of Afrin, which lots of human rights condemnation from various groups has come out with accusations that Turkey has already, to a large extent, ethnically cleansed Kurds. Some people say there's over 100,000 refugees out of Afrin canton, which population-wise wasn't that large to begin with. Mm-hmm. But of course, for the EU to condemn Turkey here, particularly, in light that they themselves had military occupation forces on the ground in East Syria in violation of international law without the permission of the Syrian government, simply because those Kurdish fighters in that area were military partnership, serving as military proxies for the U.S. and various European Union member states' occupation of East Syria. It all smacks me as rather hypocritical.
Hypocritical is indeed the word that's coming to my mind also, but I want to get your opinion, Mr. Travers, on how you see this. Is NATO even a significant player anymore, or all these statements coming from the Secretary General are just simply words?
We're seeing NATO completely divided. We have the US and the United Kingdom coming out with a policy line in which they are supporting Turkey largely, or if the US is not necessarily just entirely in words supporting Turkey, is at least condoning the actions. Meanwhile, France and Belgium are taking a completely different tack to how Germany are taking. Meanwhile, France and Germany are taking the same policy tack in terms of the suspension of weapons trading deals. So essentially what we're seeing is a NATO alliance that's not quite an alliance. It's got deeply divided policies. The policies aren't actually working with each other. You have member states taking completely different actions and completely different stances. How long is this credible? I don't know how long this individual approach can go on. How long can you have Turkey, for example, continuing to do things that its fellow members of NATO dislike, but at the same time you then have other countries taking a completely separate stance? You can't have that within a military alliance, surely.
Right. And Mr. Sleboda, also the US, along with Russia, that on Thursday vetoed essentially a UNSC statement by France, Germany and Belgium condemning Turkey's operation because there was a conflict, there was a dispute over the very word condemn for Turkey's move.
Yeah. Both Russia and the United States have been very careful in this geopolitical dance in Syria with Turkey. It's been kind of a three-way Mexican standoff for close to 2 years now, with the U.S. occupation force, the Turkish occupation force, and Russian forces there in support of the Syrian government, all staring each other down. And both Russia and the United States are afraid that Turkey might swing completely the other way towards their geopolitical opponent. And that could be a problem, not just for Syria, but for the area beyond. And to his credit, Erdogan has been rather successfully playing Russia and the United States off of each other, as well as neutering the European Union, at least up till now, with his constant threats that he would flood Europe with Syrian refugees. He would open the borders and allow them to pass through without check, unless the European Union continues to cough up money. And the European Union has. They've coughed up billions of dollars in what is quite openly blackmail money. And now Erdogan has threatened to open the borders once again if the EU considers and openly calls what Turkey has done here an invasion, in those words, an invasion.
Right. So, Mr. Travers, in your opinion, do you think clearly the UN has shown its sort of lack of authority, and not just this conflict, but many more in the recent history. But the EU, NATO, and the US itself right now are in a position to call a stop, considering that they were given an opportunity, according to the foreign minister of Turkey, who's recently said that after many efforts to resolve this problem with the international community, they have failed. So we have gone ahead of this with this offensive. Do they have any say now, any validity, credibility to make a stop to what Turkey is doing?
What you've highlighted is, yes, they have the power, but do they have the credibility? And actually, do they have the willpower too? And I think the real question here is, yes, I think they would have the power to stop it. Do they have the validity? I don't think they do. I really think they're struggling to come to a collective policy, which is a problem. But as Mark has identified, there is a real problem here in the fact that Erdogan has played this exceptionally well. He knows that they cannot in any way move, or the refugee problem becomes a massive political problem in Europe as well. He knows refugees aren't just a problem economically for Europe, but also politically. He knows that it fuels movements which can also be anti-war as well. And in moving these isolationist, anti-globalist response, Erdogan's really in a win-win situation. He floods Europe with refugees, and you see anti-globalists fuel and get stronger in government. Meanwhile, if he doesn't do that and Europe can, kind of sit at the sidelines, he's got his military objective. So really, Erdogan is in a strong position. As for the US and more so the UK, I'm not so sure that they have the ability to do so. The UK has so many other pressing problems, and I think the US as well, obviously with an impeachment process possibly happening, you're going to see a lot of political discussion and perhaps a shutdown and gridlock in both countries.
Right. And Mr. Stoltenberg also said this, Ms. Boda, this question is for you, that while he stopped short of condemning this move by Turkey, he's also said that right now what we need to identify is that global efforts to put a sort of hold on ISIL, to get hold of ISIL, to suppress ISIL, to eliminate him, is being jeopardized because of the kind of instability this operation is creating. Can you highlight for us how so this could be happening?
Well, of course, there are a large number of captured ISIS fighters in the previous U.S. occupation zone of East Syria. That includes at least some 10,000 fighters. Accordingly, some 2,000 of those foreign fighters, many of them from Europe. Europe refuses to take them back. And then some 70,000 so-called ISIS family. These are wives and children, and no country wants to take them. The cost, the expensive de-radicalization programs, the threats of further terrorism. No one wants to assume responsibility for them. And the Kurdish forces within the Syrian Democratic Forces have pulled some of their troops away to defend their own families, their homes in northern Syria, from the invading Turkish forces and their jihadi proxies. Now, most of these camps are further to the south, but there are a couple with roughly 1,000 or so detainees close to the Turkish border, and at least one of those has already been occupied. Although Turkey is claiming that they found the prison empty, the United States, the Kurds, the Syrian government, and Russia are all speaking now as one, actually agreeing on something, and that is that the Turkish proxies, this so-called Syrian National Army, which is essentially 80,000 Islamists and jihadists under arms, that when they came to this camp, they released the ISIS prisoners, and more than likely their own numbers increased by the same number of ISIS fighters that they released, because it's been well reported that these Turkish proxy forces contain large numbers of former al-Qaeda and ISIS members.
So then the question I'm going to put to you here, Mr. is then the role Russia is playing itself. I just mentioned that it was one of the members that vetoed a UNSC resolution condemning Turkey. And at the same time, now that the Syrian army has entered Manbij, the main one of the main central northern regions in Syria, to create this safe zone, what does this mean? How does this reflect on Russia's role?
I mean, I think Russia's role has massively changed in this conflict for a wide variety of reasons. What we are seeing now is Russia kind of almost even outplayed by Erdogan. I think actually, interestingly, Russia obviously largely provided support for the Syrian regime, but now Russia kind of almost finds itself in a Mexican standoff, as Mark said, with the US. And what Erdogan is quite aware of, what he's doing here is he's essentially putting them at each other's throats. And he knows that risks a wider conflict. And I think he knows that on both sides actually do want to avoid a larger conflict. So what Erdogan has essentially done is done a kind of maneuver in which he's put two sides, but, apparently bitter enemies, near a position in which they could attack each other, specifically as a way of stopping and neutralizing their forces whilst he has a power grab. It's actually it's a very powerful, very astute move in a dark way, but a very astute move of a very,
Mr. Sleboda, do you agree with Mr. Travers? Do you think President Erdogan is the one who's outmaneuvered Russia, or do you think it's been the other way around?
I see it quite as the other way around. I think that President Putin, in his muted condemnation of Turkey in the beginning, has rather skillfully used Turkey to help drive the U.S. out of eastern Syria. At the same time, they've driven a further wedge into NATO, with both European Union members and the U.S. condemning Turkey, the U.S. launching sanctions, the EU putting an arms embargo, while at the same time Syrian army and Russian troops race across. They've forged the deal with the Kurdish forces. They've recovered almost the entirety of eastern Syria without a shot being fired. They've increased their own numbers, buttressed with Kurdish forces. And then Erdogan's big incursion, and he's promised, he's got big domestic problems with this 3.6 million refugees himself. The Turkish people want them gone, and he promised to take them out of Turkey and resettle them in this zone. And now he's penned into a 5-kilometer incursion zone between two Arab-majority towns, and he's got no place left to turn. He doesn't have any allies anymore. He's now estranged from the U.S., the European Union, Russia, and suddenly he's looking in a very bad position. He can't use Turkish air power anymore to buttress his army and his proxies, because Russia, the U.S. has basically turned over control of the air in eastern Syria over to Russia, and Russia has powerful air defense and air forces on their own. So unless Turkey is willing...
I'm going to interrupt you here, Mr. Sleboda. I also want your thoughts on, at the same time, what we're seeing reports of, a very not that well covered, not making headlines as much. Last Tuesday, I believe, there was an agreement between when the Russian finance ministry, they announced that Moscow and Ankara had come up with an agreement on using Russian rubles and Turkish lira as mutual payments and settlements. Now, this was happening during a time where the U.S. had announced that they would withdraw, and the Turks soon followed with their announcement that they will start their offensive. What do you make of that?
Yeah, Russia has had a policy, and I think in total, over time, it has been very effective of separating its relations with Turkey outside of the Syria conflict zone, where they have deepening economic and social relations, pipelines, Russian building nuclear power stations, tourism, etc. And in Syria, where they are de facto at war with each other. And part of the rationale here is that Russia doesn't want to go to war with Turkey, whether it's in good relations with NATO at the moment or not. Russia wants to pat Turkey's hand, reassure Erdogan that it takes their security threat, interests seriously, but insists slowly that they get out of Syria, and promising them a carrot of good economic relations on the other hand, as they try to help Erdogan save face and get out of what is potentially a very large quagmire now for Turkey in Syria. So
he's also offered. Mr. Putin's also invited him, in fact, to Mr. Erdogan, to Russia, to discuss this situation. And there's something that, an invitation that has been accepted. But very quickly, we're running out of time, Mr. Travers. One last question. How do you take the U.S. reaction? I just want to quote here the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper's statement. Turkey's unilateral action was unnecessary and impulsive. President Erdogan bears full responsibility for its consequences. The bilateral relationship between our two countries has also been damaged. And then he goes on to say that he plans to press NATO allies to take collective and individual diplomatic and economic measures in response to egregious Turkish actions. What do you make of the U.S.'s statements coming in?
Well, I don't think the US statement is going to be nearly as effective as anything we've seen from the Russians or the Turks, because they have a divided alliance. We saw French and Belgian delegates at the NATO Assembly criticising not just Mr. Trump, but the US administration, and making veiled jokes about the response. So I really think the US, and I think in some ways its president, really cannot have a really pressing response to this, because other countries are simply mocking them.
And so words full of hot air. Well, out of time, Mr. Mark Sleboda and Mr. Robbie Travers, thank you so much for giving us your insight into this story as it develops. But right now, we're going to take a quick short break. We'll be back with updates from what is happening in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Don't go away. Welcome back to Newswire. Talking about the many developments in Indian-occupied Kashmir is what's coming up. But first of all, let's discuss the arrest of at least 13 women during an anti-India protest that made headlines yesterday. The sister and daughter of former Jammu and Kashmir Chief Minister Farooq Abdullah, who is himself currently under house arrest, the daughter and sister were also arrested. The protest was largely against the scrapping of Article 370, and these protesters were holding placards which read, "Kashmiri brides not for sale," "Why downgrade Jammu and Kashmir state," and many other such statements. It wasn't long before the police, who was watching on the sidelines, immediately got into action and started taking the protesters away to a nearby police station. So we will be talking to Miss Nayeema Mahjoor, who is a Kashmiri herself, recently had to leave Srinagar, her hometown, and is currently in London. An analyst and a journalist herself, who has covered the issues in Indian-occupied Kashmir for a while, is now speaking to us to elaborate more on this. Ms. Mahjoor, thank you so much for taking out the time today to speak to us. This latest development, this protest where we just saw a few days ago signs of the Indian government restoring mobile phone services somewhat, and then we see this extreme clampdown on a group of peaceful protesters of women.
Yeah, I mean, this is the irony that the women who were yesterday protesting against this abrogation of Article 370 and the degradation of this state into two union territories, and most of these women, they belong to the pro-mainstream group, which until 5th of August were all, very close to Indian side, Indian government. And the sister and daughter of Farooq Abdullah. Farooq Abdullah has been a 3-time Chief Minister of State of Jammu and Kashmir. And these women, they've been holding high posts in Indian government, in Indian establishments. And then they are coming out in open and protesting, and a peaceful protest. Then the mishandling and the high-handedness of the government of India yesterday, putting them into jail and then asking them to give a bond that if you are released, you are not going to do any other protests regarding Article 370. I mean, this seems totally, what sort of the steps government of India is taking at the moment to foil these peaceful protesters. But I don't think these protesters will stop because the people, they are still in anger. They want to give dissent against this decision. And no matter how many, security personnel are there, people are coming out, and people, I think, will come out to, give their strong resentment about these decisions.
Also, the J&K administration, it tried to justify what you mentioned right now, the political leadership, the local political leadership either being behind bars or being under house arrest. And in this case, they justified the slapping of the Public Safety Act on the National Conference president, saying that he has tremendous potential, and I'm quoting them here, tremendous potential to create public disorder in Srinagar in other parts of the valley. When the administration comes out and says this statement on one hand, and on the other side to the world says that it's absolutely normal, that in fact people are very happy with the 1 million plus troops there, what comes to your mind?
That is the grotesque. They've been contradicting their own statements. On one hand, they've been trumpeting that the Kashmir is normal. And the second moment, they are going in droves and arresting these peaceful women who just went outside in Lal Chowk to went against this decision. People are watching. International community is watching this. How they are, handling Kashmir at the moment, which has gone out of hand, I think. And that's why they just, they have released some phones, they have opened landlines, but they know something is going to get big because people are not happy. Majority is not happy with the decision.
Ms. Mahjoor, do you think the government is worried that if they completely remove the communication lockdown, the curfews, if they completely remove this, there will be very dire consequences?
There are. There have been protesters going on. Even there are so many curbs, the curtailment of movement, and this lockdown, communication blockade. There are some protests going on in downtown area, in downtown Srinagar. But now, if they are going to, lift these restrictions altogether, I'm sure that most of the people are not going to sit idle and watch how their rights have been taken, how their movements have been curtailed. They will come out and they will show resentment and they will register protest. But that's why how yesterday the few women coming into the street and then the security forces arresting them and taking them to jail. That shows the nervousness of the Indian government at the moment. That's why they don't want to take a risk letting people to come out on the road and just start protesting.
Ms. Mahjoor, how long do you think the Indian government, how long do you think New Delhi can continue this kind of these kind of actions, which in a way analysts say is distracting from the inner problem? A recent report just published announced that India has slipped to 102nd position in the Global 100 Index. It's done worse. In fact, it's now behind its neighbors Nepal and Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Yeah, I think because, the state assembly elections are going in Maharashtra and Haryana. And that's why they are just keeping this lid over this situation. Otherwise, government itself knows the situation is very volatile in Jammu and Kashmir. Once they lift restrictions, there is going to be some protests and there is going to be some sort of a big thing. And that's why they just want to put this all under the cover and until the elections are over, because the government thinks that they are going to win by a landslide majority in Maharashtra and Haryana. After that, I think the restrictions will be lifted, but government still knows that Kashmiris have not accepted this decision, and once the restrictions are lifted, they will come out and they will protest against this decision.
Thank you, Ms. Nayeema Mahjoor, for taking out the time speaking to us about this situation that seems to be at the brink of imploding, where an indigenous movement continues to be at the brink of imploding from the kind of subjugation it's facing. Meanwhile, India continues to distract with its actions on the line of control. Again, there was firing and it took the life of 3 individuals, one 55-year-old man, a 12-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy. The Indian Army has been continuing indiscriminate firing across the line of control, deliberately aiming at populated areas here with artillery fire, with heavy caliber mortars and automatic weapons. Pakistan has lodged a complaint and said that India needs to comply with the rules and regulations of the UN Military Observer Group for India and Pakistan to let it play its mandated role as per the UN Security Council resolutions. And with that, we've run out of time to discuss this more, but we will be seeing you again next week. Till then, it's goodbye from me and the team of Newswire.